So a lot of this stuff is going to be pretty unsettling maybe to people who haven't looked into how widespread these endocrine disruptors are. But
Mhm.
before we like really dive into some
Yeah.
of that stuff, I want to talk a little bit about estrogen signaling and estrogen receptors and sensitivity in the body. So obviously, the body has natural estrogens that it produces. As you mentioned, we've got BPA and other xenoestrogens, artificial estrogens that we're going to talk about. Can you say a little bit about estrogen receptors? How many estrogen receptors are there? And is there anything sort of special or notable about them in terms of their sensitivity or how they work that's going to be important for
Mhm.
understanding some of the other things we're going to talk about?
Yeah, there are three estrogen receptors. Two of them uh, that are the more classical ones are estrogen receptor alpha and estrogen receptor beta.
Mm-hmm.
They belong to the so-called family of nuclear receptors, and they classically act as transcription factors.
Hmm.
So they bind the ligand, the natural hormone, in this case 17 beta estradiol. They dimerize, they go to the nucleus or are already in the nucleus, depending on the cell, and bind to an estrogen response element in the DNA. And that puts all the machinery of transcription to work,
Hmm.
okay, and increases gene expression. And there is another type of response, which of these very same receptors, which is not in the nucleus. It's what we call extranuclear initiated effects. So in the last 30 years, there have been many different studies that have been published to show that these receptors, ER alpha and ER beta, are able to activate kinases outside the nucleus, such as uh, PI3 kinase, ERK1/2, MAP kinases in general, and then to regulate other proteins or signaling pathways,
I see.
including ion channels.
Hmm.
So we have like two ways the cell respond to estrogens in terms of estrogen receptors. The
I see.
nuclear one, which is the very classic one, and the extranuclear, which is rapidly initiated and activates as signaling. And this one is very particularly important in terms of endocrine disruptors.
I see. So oftentimes when we
And
when we when we
yeah,
think about a receptor, they're often located on the outside of the cell, and the cell responds to something on the outside, and this leads to changes
yeah,
on the inside of the cell. But for some of so for these estrogen receptors, they are internal receptors. They're either located
exactly,
in the cytosol or in the nucleus. And in the
exactly.
nucleus, when something like an estrogen binds to these nuclear receptors, that's directly leading to transcriptional changes. So genes get turned on or turned off, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And later there is one more estrogen receptor that was proposed about 2005, uh, and it's a G protein coupled receptor. It's called GPER.
Mm-hmm.
It's at the membrane, and it seems that it binds estradiol as well, and have produce estrogenic signaling.
I see.
This
So you've
one
got,
is less studied, but
yeah,
it seems that it's also there at the membrane. So we
yeah,
have
three
the two
layers of
nuclear
control.
receptors, exactly, and one at the membrane. And they crosstalk, so that makes life complicated.
Yeah,
But
yeah. So, estrogen is flowing through the bloodstream. It can get into cells. It can get all the way through the membrane into the cell, through another membrane, that's the nuclear membrane, and it's going to
mhm.
regulate gene transcription in the nucleus. It can also get through the outer membrane, but not pass through the nuclear membrane and regulate what certain proteins are doing in the cytoplasm. And there's also potentially these estrogen receptors on the outer membrane